Good morning and good afternoon. It's very rainy here. I don't know if you can hear it on the roof. It's kind of lovely. And hi to Chinny. Are you in India? Chinny, you must be in India.
Yeah, I'm in India. Yeah, I'm inside my mosquito net.
It's wonderful. Well, I wanted to talk about, I guess, like the complexities of compassion. And I did a Google search, complex compassion, to see if there was anything there, and there wasn't really anything very much. So I don't think it's a term particularly, but it did occur to me that it's an interesting thing to think about. Um, in our tradition, of course, compassion is almost the foundation. We have the two sides, emptiness, um, just everything is fine as it is, everything is interconnected, nothing to be done. We have that side, and then we have the side of there is suffering in this world, and our kind of purpose in many ways is to be of benefit to beings in the world. So compassion is such an important part, sort of the center, the heart of our practice. And in some ways, compassion seems extremely straightforward when we deeply understand that there's no other. Then compassion just is spontaneous. It's just natural. We naturally feel empathy towards others and naturally want others not to suffer. It's just very simple, very natural. But at the same time, people make things very complicated. With our minds, we complicate things a lot. And so how to be compassionate sometimes is just not nearly so straightforward. So I kind of made a list. This is not any official list from anywhere. It's just kind of a list of different ways in which being compassionate is not so straightforward. I just thought I would share them and see if they resonate with you. And the reason it would be good if they do resonate with you is it can help us be compassionate towards ourselves when we're confused about what's a good way to respond to something. To help us not feel so bad if we're not sure what's the best way to respond. And just before I go through the list, the other thought that I had is, even though I'm using this phrase, complex compassion, that reality itself is not complicated at all. Reality just is. The world just is itself. It's nothing complicated about it. It just is. But with our minds, we try to grasp it, and in trying to grasp reality, we create a lot of very complex ideas and relationships and thoughts and opinions and so on. And I was thinking it's a bit like a cup of tea. In one way, a cup of tea is very complicated. There's someone who brewed the tea somewhere. There's all the sort of biology that goes into how tea grows. There's the harvesting and the drying of the tea, and then there's the transporting of the tea and the packaging of the tea and the buying of the tea and the making of the tea. In some ways, tea is very, very complicated. In another way, we just have a cup of tea and we just drink a cup of tea. It's extremely straightforward. So compassion, I think, is the same. It's very straightforward, nothing complicated about it. And because of our minds and language, it can be really quite complicated. So the first kind of thought I had about this is Sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is to be really patient. This has been something I've had to learn a lot in my life. We can want to sort of intercept or want to give suggestions to someone because we can see in front of us, it appears to us that what they're doing is causing themselves harm or causing others harm, and we can see it right in front of us. And sometimes we want to do something about it. And if we're lucky, when we do something about it, it works out. Like we might say, I think it's not such a good idea that you do that to someone, and they might go, really? And you go, yeah, I mean, it just feels like, you know, you're making your life worse. And they might listen to us and go, I think you're right. Thank you for that. I really, really appreciate it. That might be what happens. But other times we might test the waters of giving our opinion to someone, and we experience pushback, and they don't want to hear our opinion, or they just disagree with us. And then sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is not to keep on trying. Sometimes when we keep on trying to make something better with some other person, we just make things worse. So sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is to learn to be very patient and just trust that if we're patient and we keep having empathic feelings, and we're not patronizing in our minds, we're not feeling like we know what's best, but we're just aware that the situation doesn't look ideal and we would like it to be different for that person's sake. We can just keep being patient and see what opportunities arise. And maybe over time, just by the way we're being, the other person might become more receptive, or the situation might change. Or we discover that getting our advice really wasn't the best idea anyway, and maybe we could just be helpful in some other way, which allows that person to change of their own accord. So being patient is a form of compassion. It doesn't always immediately feel satisfying, and it can be a little bit confusing. Should I just keep watching this thing that doesn't feel right? Sometimes that's the most compassionate thing to do. Just be patient and see what unfolds over time. Maybe just our general kindness to that person will give them the strength they need to make the changes that would be beneficial to them without us having to give our opinions at all. And then I was thinking of another sort of compassion. It's kind of compassion in disguise. We do this often with children, where they want something that's not good for them, and we have to say, no, you cannot have another cookie. You've already had one. One is enough. And then they're desperately unhappy about that. You just stand your ground. I'm sorry, I know you want another one, but one is enough. And they collapse on the floor in a heap crying. How could you be so mean? But we're really being compassionate. We're being really compassionate by saying no. It's not always easy to trust that we're being compassionate when we say no. But if we look at it closely and we know that that is our motivation, that we're really saying no because we care, even though they can't see it, then we are being compassionate. And if we can really trust that we're being compassionate, doing compassion in disguise, then we can do it really skillfully and not have to go overboard. We don't have to get angry when they get upset with us for saying no. We can just calmly go, I've already told you, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. End of the story, no more cookies. And just leave it at that. And they'll eventually just go off and play with Lego or something. But it applies with our adult relationships as well, of course, not just with children. Sometimes we just need to say no to things. Sometimes we need to say no for their sake, like with the cookie example. And sometimes we need to say no for our own sake, because for our own self-care, we need to say no. Like, I'd really like to come, but I'm just very tired. I think I just need to stay home today. Or someone might ask a favor of us, and it just feels like that's too much of a favor to ask. Doesn't sit right with us. We can't do it wholeheartedly. If we said yes, we'd feel some resentment maybe, or maybe feel a little uncomfortable, like it didn't fit with what feels like the right boundaries for us. So we might have to say no. But if we can understand in our mind that this is a form of compassion, it's just in disguise, then we can say no and do it really skillfully and not have to get defensive about it. And just say no gently. And then another thought I had about compassion is sometimes silence can be a form of compassion. I know that I can sometimes be a little bit chatty, and if in a group of people there's a conversation happening and someone shares a story and everyone really enjoys the story, and the person telling the story is enjoyed being listened to, like they're enjoying their role that they're in, of the storyteller, and then in my mind I feel like I have an even better story I could tell. I might decide in that moment, it'd be kind of really fun to tell this story, but I can see that other person's really enjoying being the center of attention, so I don't need to tell my story. I can just enjoy the story they told and not need to add another story. It's just little moments like that kind of happen in our lives a lot, where we can just be silent, and it's a form of compassion. All sorts of ways that silence can be a form of compassion. There can be a little dilemma sometimes when somebody criticizes someone to us, and the best thing to do is just go, just make a little sound. Oh, if we agree, then we're maybe causing harm. But if we disagree or try to say, I don't think that's a nice thing to say, then we're also maybe embarrassing that person who just said that thing. So sometimes the most compassionate thing is just to be silent or make a very neutral sound. The whole idea that I got for talking about this idea of complex compassion was that a couple of weeks ago, someone shared something with me and asked me not to share it with anybody. And I couldn't decide whether that was okay or not. I still haven't been able to decide whether it's okay or not for me to hold this information and not share it. And the thought that I had at that time was, sometimes compassion is really complex, which is what led to the idea of this talk. So I think in a case like that, sometimes we can have situations where there's no easy compassionate response at all. There's just not an easy one. We don't know what's the right thing to do. We just don't know. We don't know, not because we're fools or anything, but because there's so many layers and we can't unpack them all, and we don't know the outcome of different options. We can't tell what the outcome of the different options would be. We don't want to make things worse, but we also don't want to passively allow something to happen that might cause harm. And so we're kind of in a complicated situation. These days, when I find myself in a situation like that, which is not very often, but I try to just really slow down, not take action straight away, sleep on it, discuss it maybe confidentially with a few people I trust, sleep on it again, and then slowly make a decision. Do I do something? Do I not do something? Or do a little bit of something, not as much as they wanted to do or I wanted to do, something in between. Just try to move very carefully. Because at the very least, we want to try and not do harm. We want to try our best to not do harm. We can't necessarily do good. We want to at least try not to do harm. So sometimes there's just really complicated circumstances where it's not really easy to figure out. And sometimes we just have to wait until things unfold to find out whether what we did do or didn't do, whether that turned out to have been a good choice or not. And it might turn out that our action or our inaction turned out to be the right thing to do. Or it might turn out that in hindsight, it would have been better had I done something else. But as long as we're really coming from a place of trying to do our best to be caring for everybody, caring for the people involved, as well as including ourselves in that, as long as we're doing our best, then that's what we're doing, we're just doing our best. And a little bit similar to that idea of just complicated situations, sometimes we can have real dilemmas where whatever action we take, somebody is going to get hurt. There's the only two choices we have is we've got a situation where either this person gets hurt or this person gets hurt. And they're very difficult dilemmas. Some of those that I experienced a lot living in America was people in Central America and South America coming into the United States and having to make incredibly difficult decisions because of economic hardship and violence in their communities, of which child to take with them and which child to leave behind. You know, very complicated decisions where there was just no good solution. The child you took with you might make it or might not make it, might die in the process of trying to immigrate. The child left behind is left behind without their parents. Just impossible choices that people have to make, but they have to make them. They kind of have to make them. And even myself, I had comparatively a much smaller version of that, but nevertheless, the most painful experience of my life was having to choose whether to stay in America with an 8-year-old child and not be with my older teenager. I had a son who was a teenager and a daughter who was in her early 20s, having to decide which country to be in. And I had to make that decision. And I had to choose the younger child. There was just no other, it was the obvious choice, but it was a very, very painful choice. It was harmful for my children in Australia. It's harmful for them to be separated from me for so many years. But it couldn't do it any different. There was just no other way, just because of immigration laws at that in our circumstances at that time. And so for years afterwards, we navigated that. We navigated it successfully in the end, which I'm extremely grateful for, but it was very, very painful. It was a dilemma. And I found it unbelievably hard to intentionally choose something that some people were going to be extremely unhappy about and was going to actually be harmful for their development. We just had to make it. So sometimes we have these dilemmas. Hopefully often they're much smaller, just very little ones. Somebody wants you to go out with them there, somebody else wants you to go out with them there, and you can't go both places, so you have to pick one and disappoint the other. Hopefully that's the extent of the dilemmas most of us will have to face in our lives. But sometimes people are faced with extremely difficult ones. And so we can still act compassionately, and particularly in situations like that, to be compassionate to ourselves. So we can't be heroes. We can't solve everything. We can't make everything right for everyone. It's really important that we are compassionate to ourselves in these kind of complicated situations where we just can't make everything okay for everyone. And then another situation, sometimes I don't really like this term, but it's called idiot compassion. But over time, I don't really like that term very much. But it is useful to talk about. Maybe you could call it something like self-harming compassion. It's not truly compassionate because we're harming ourselves. But when we have a situation where we're being compassionate towards someone else, but in doing so, we're actually harming ourselves beyond what would be okay. I mean, it's nice for us to extend ourselves and to say yes as much as we can, like start with yes, which I think I mentioned last week. This idea, start with yes, to be compassionate and caring towards others, even if it's a little hard for ourselves. I think that's a really good place to start. And I try to be that way, to extend myself and not worry too much if something's going to be tiring or a little bit inconvenient, like that's okay. It's totally okay. I don't mind at all. Extending ourselves that way, I think, is a very important part of our practice. But there's a point at which nobody can decide where it is. We need to work this out for ourselves, case by case, where maybe we're actually focusing too much on the other person's needs, very much at our own expense. And the kind of fairly obvious example of this that all of us would be familiar with is being in an unhealthy relationship, where the other person is the balance. There's not a balance of care in the relationship. One person is doing a lot more and caring a lot more and compromising a lot more than the other person, and they keep on doing that, It looks like compassion, and it probably does have a lot of compassion in it, like a genuine caring for the other person, like a genuinely caring for them, but it's not caring enough for ourselves. We have to factor ourselves into the many beings that need our compassion. We're part of the cries of the world. The cries of the world aren't just out there. We're included in the many cries of the world that we're wanting to be compassionate towards. And closely related to that too, I think we can have a fear-based kind of compassion where we're kind and caring partly out of fear that we'll be rejected or judged or criticized if we don't behave that way. So it's important, I think, for us to look at what is our motivation when we're being caring towards someone. What's our motivation? Maybe it's all right for a little bit of the motivation to be, I don't want them to be cross with me. Maybe it's okay for that to be a bit of the motivation. But we wouldn't want it to be a very loud part of the motivation. It could just be a little bit of it. We don't want it to be a loud part. So with our kindness, is driven out of fear of what people will think of us if we're not kind, that would be a really good thing to spend time with, contemplate and examine closely about fear. It's good to imagine fearlessness, that there's a way to be fearless in this world. Good to imagine that. And then one I made up called ulterior motives, compassion, when we're kind because of what we'll gain from being kind. So there's a bit of an ulterior motive there. And again, this is kind of complicated because society is built on a certain amount of reciprocity. You know, I'll do this for you, you do that for me. You know, there's a reciprocity that helps society function, but we do that. We do things for each other, and in return, things will be done for us, and it's a beautiful exchange. It's also good to notice, in particular, if we're being caring towards someone, is there some motive that's self-serving mixed in with it? And it's okay if there is, but it's just good to notice how much of it is mixed. And of course, we hold very highly in the Zen tradition of being compassionate without needing or wanting any kind of reward at all. Just doing it because you can't help it. Just being kind, it's just flowing naturally, can't help it. There's nothing that you want from it. Even not really wanting it necessarily to have to work, just being caring because you can't help it. That's really how we want to be. And then just a couple of little thoughts that I had, that sometimes we can miss an opportunity. Like afterwards we think, oh, now I realize in that conversation that maybe that person was sort of asking something of me, but I couldn't quite hear it at the time. But maybe afterwards on reflection, we realize they kind of were. I think this happened last night with one of my sons. He was saying how he needed a new pair of shoes. And I just sort of went like, oh yeah, that's a good idea to get a new pair of shoes. And then a little bit later in the conversation, he mentioned that it was his birthday next week. And I went, oh yeah, it is, birthday next week. All right, see you later, bye. And I hung up. And in the middle of the night, I thought, oh, well, maybe it would be nice for me to pay for his shoes. So I sent him a message this morning. If you get a chance to buy a new pair of boots, this is my son who's on the farm making mud bricks. If you need to get a new pair of boots, I'll pay for them for your birthday. And like 2 seconds later, ding, thank you. A little heart, symbol, thank you. So if we miss an opportunity, like I missed it last night, we can always catch up later. So they're just some thoughts about compassion, mainly for the purpose to help us be thoughtful about our actions and our thoughts, to observe them, be kind to ourselves, because the world can be a complicated place, and at the same time to remember it's not at all complicated. So we can also just relax. So relax and be reflective, both things. So stop there and see if anyone would like to comment, ask a question.